Hi everyone, I hope you're all having a wonderful week. Apologies if I'm a bit croaky this week, I'm a little bit under the weather. This week we're talking about post 9/11 policing, and this video is just going to focus on talking through, things like the learning objectives and things for both the videos, and then focusing on exactly what this is, defining it, defining terrorism, things like that. So you probably recognise this particular photo on this first slide that I've got, which is three people which they believe are responsible for the bombings in, I think it was Brussels. I could be wrong. It's been a little while now. These types of attacks are becoming more common. We've seen quite a few in the last few years in particular, and they're quite varied in their nature, who they're targeting, what their message is, all of those types of things. So I wanted today to talk a little bit about what this idea of terrorism means, so that we can better understand how police have responded to it and will continue to respond to it in the future. So, yeah, by the end of the lecture or lectures, I hope you understand what terrorism is, what counter-terrorism policing is, and why you need to think critically about counter-terrorism policing. And we'll be talking through all of those issues on the Milo side as well. So the key point that you need to know about terrorism is that it is really hard to define, and a lot of different people will define it in different ways depending on what the circumstances are, what they're trying to do in their research project, for instance, what the message they're trying to send about what they're doing with terrorism around, their particular nation, for instance. There's a lot of debate about formulating a definition that actually captures the variety of acts that encompass terrorism, but exclude other particular acts, because it can be a subjective thing to try and figure out what terrorism looks like and how some things are terrorism and other things aren't. So they're very typically politically motivated groups or individuals who use violence targeted at non-combatants, so people who are, I suppose, innocent members of the public. And they do this to terrify publics and leaders into social change. It's a very invisible crime. It's a silent crime that we don't hear about unless we're on the end of some sort of listening device which has been sanctioned by the state. They plan and prepare clandestine operations, and their acts seek to generate publicity. And that is, without a doubt, the most important focus of the work of these different types of groups and individuals. In fact, they are so well funded now and so well organised that some terrorist groups actually have whole media rooms set up with screens all over the walls, etc., watching news all over the world to monitor the impact and the fear that they're creating within the public with their different types of acts of terrorism. It's really quite extraordinary. So yeah, when we're thinking about terrorist violence, we're thinking of dramatic attack signal targets. It's dramatic violence. It's very high profile. Often they're not going to do it where they go into somebody's house and kill a few people and then walk away. It's really about getting a message across. They attack signal targets for that reason. Lots and lots of people, usually quite significantly public spaces and events and so forth. And they do that to attract media attention to amplify the effect. It also combines a range of combative tactics, and it's typically used by weak groups. So groups that feel like they don't have power in the public eye against what they consider to be their more powerful enemies. It's very much not state-sponsored terrorism, and we have seen quite a bit of that as well in different war times and peace times, depending on what the circumstances are. But I'm not going to talk about that today. You can read up a little bit about that if you're interested. So it's really important, I think, to not think about terrorism as separate from other crimes. It is very much a crime, but it does tend to be thought about on its own as a different type of criminal activity. And that's because they think about it as a macro crime up here at the level of society, and down here it's having an impact on the people. But in a huge, in a broad sense, they're aiming to try and get this political message out to as many people as possible. So it's very much a crime with a political motive, and that's how it differentiates itself from other types of crime. But I don't think it's possible to think about it being different to other types of crime. I think in certain ways, when we think about punishment and so forth, that it's definitely thought about differently in that respect, because it's thought about as a crime against the state, sometimes crimes against humanity and so forth. But overall, it shouldn't be thought about as being different from other crimes or separate from other crimes. So counterterrorism policing then involves a whole range of different types of activities. And we hopefully by the end of this week you'll have a better understanding of what that looks like. So there's this term that we call high policing. This is where it engages multiple police agencies in partnership. It involves observation, subversion of different types of activity, disruption of groups that are deemed to be transgressive in different ways. And that doesn't necessarily mean terrorist groups in the way that we think about it now. It could also be they could also be thinking of environmental activist groups in that sense as well. And overall, low policing is still involved, which is that very everyday response, arrest, prosecution, and all of those types of things. But high policing is a very different type of policing. It often overrides different types of rules and powers, different types of legislative frameworks that other police have to abide by. It provides them with powers that other police don't have, all of those types of things. And when we think about how to conceptualize these types of policing, it's useful to think about it on a continuum. At one end, we have this sort of military model where terrorism's dealt with using warlike forms of aggression, and a good way of sort of thinking about this is very much the war on terror after the 9/11 attacks and the US invasion of the Middle East. And then there's what we call the criminal justice model, which is where we go through the usual processes of detecting and prosecuting terrorism, using information, and all of those types of things. Terrorism is dealt with as a range of different criminal acts. In the military model, they will have a lot more power to seize and to, get information out of people by using different forms of coercion and torture and all of those types of things. And we saw all of those ethical issues raised around Abu Ghraib in particular. And then at the other end, the criminal justice model, all of those usual powers are still in place. They don't have any additional powers on top of that. And they deal with terrorism as a type of criminal act. And a great example of this is very much, I don't know if you're aware of it, but a young boy in the US, I think he was high school, he made his own clock as part of a science experiment, and for a science competition, and he brought it to school, and the teachers thought he had a bomb, so they called the local police, and they came in and arrested him, and it was pretty awful, and Obama responded pretty well. He invited him to the White House to have dinner with him, which is pretty groovy. But that's a very typical criminal justice model where they would go into the school and arrest the young boy, take him into detention, all of that sort of stuff, put him through the court. It's pretty interesting stuff. Local police are still important, however, and it's really vital not to think that they somehow disappear in these moments. Kelling and Bratton argue that local police play a critical role in defeating terrorism, which they claim is not much different from other crime. So they gather intelligence about it. They go and they get information from different, sources and so forth, exactly the same way they would in any other crime. They go and talk to people in the neighbourhood, all of those types of things. So Kelling and Bratton argue that counterterrorism has to be woven into the everyday workings of every police department. It should be included on the agenda of every meeting, and this new role must be imparted to officers on the street so that terrorism prevention becomes part of their everyday thinking. And I would completely agree that if you put it over to the side here, say this is your police organisation, and over to the side here you've got this task force, and the task force works for a small amount of time and then it disappears in relation to a particular terrorist event that they know is being planned or that has actually occurred. It's important to be constantly vigilant around terrorism and to be doing that work all the time. So it needs to be part of this typical policing organisation on an everyday basis. So one important thing to remember is that terrorism is extremely rare. In fact, most people, they'd be more likely to die of shark attacks, car accidents, being shot, most definitely in the US. So they're more likely scenarios considering what we experience on a day-to-day basis. But local police still need to be involved, even though they are rare. And of course, that's a fairly big ask. Even though it's extremely rare, it's rarer than murder. Local police are unlikely to attract attention of terrorists, obviously, in terms of their everyday work. But Kelling and Bratton argue that local police cannot risk the lives of people in their community. They still have to be vigilant. They have been and will be held responsible should a disaster like this occur. It makes sense, therefore, for them to plan ahead for terrorism and even better sense to fold these plans into everyday police practice. Interestingly enough, though, their focus in recent times has changed a bit. They've moved away from these sort of small, well-organised groups like Al-Qaeda, ISIS, things like that. There's a big focus on ISIS internationally, I think, but ISIS are well above, Al-Qaeda, this sort of much smaller group. It says moved away from those small, well-organised groups to the management of multiple shifting threats from larger, less trained populations of potential subjects. So they've got a whole bunch of different groups working on these terrorist activities all at the same time, and they've got to be aware of all of those and have intelligence about all of those so that they can act at any particular point in time. And you'll notice I've got a picture here from one example from Australia of a young Muslim male who was radicalised. I cannot for the life of me remember the circumstances under which this happened. I believe it was in 2016. So in more recent times, I think they've come to realise that a handful of highly motivated people can initiate significant mayhem, and they can't just focus on the little organised cells. There could be a single person who has become radicalised in some way or another, and they decide that they're going to commit a terrorist act. They can do just as much damage as a small, highly organised group. So police need to shift the work that they do based on how terrorism changes in these types of circumstances and in the different contexts in which it comes to light. Anyway, that's it for that first part of the lecture. I hope that was useful for you, and I'll see you soon. Bye!